Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for your patience with us this evening as we navigate the world of the internet and delicious books. My name is Susie Q. Smith, and I am the conference director with The Word. And we're excited to bring this conversation to you tonight. And our partner, Duende District, is going to talk a lot more about their work. And we're going to dive into this talk. The Word is a nonprofit organization focused on equity in publishing and writing and storytelling. And we can't wait to hear from these authors tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Angela Maria Spring with Duende District, our book selling partner. Hi, Angela.
Hello, Susie. Thank you so much. Welcome to our last event of 2021. I am so thankful, as usual, to our wonderful friends at The Word. This has been an amazing year partnering with these events and so many other things. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Angela Maria Spring, the owner of Duende District, a collaborative pop-up bookstore by and for people of color where all are welcome, with current locations in Washington, D.C. and Albuquerque, New Mexico. And for those of you who are new to our bookstore story, the cornerstone of the Duende Project is about the collective, the community, and creation and decolonization of literary spaces by and for people of color. So we are so excited to welcome our special guest tonight, Dr. Rajika Bhandari, author of American Calling, a foreign student in the country of possibility, who will be in conversation with Vinod Busjeet, author of the novel Silent Winds, Dry Seas. And we'll be dropping links in the chat for both of their books, so please buy them if you get a chance. Hopefully you're buying them with us, but we're just happy to you have the books and get the books. And then if you have any questions, please put those in the chat as well. So let's go ahead and formally meet our guests. A former international student from India to the US and an India immigrant, Dr. Rajika Bhandari is an international higher education expert, a widely published author, and a sought-after speaker on issues of international education, skilled immigrants, and educational and cultural diplomacy. An author of 5 academic books and 1 previous nonfiction book, The Raj on the Move Story of the Dark Bungalow, Dr. Bhandari is quoted frequently in the global press, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, the Times of India, and Quartz. And her writing has appeared in The Guardian, The Chronicle of Higher Education, HuffPost, University World News, Times Higher Education, and The Diplomatic Courier, among others. And she lives outside New York City. And she'll be in conversation tonight with Vinod Busjeet, who was born in Mauritius, a multiracial island in the Indian Ocean. He holds degrees from Wesleyan University, New York University, and Harvard University, and spent 29 years in economic development, finance, and diplomacy, holding positions at the World Bank, International Finance Corporation, and as a secondary school teacher in Mauritius. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, and this is his first book, and I am so delighted to let them take it away.
Thank you, Angela, for introducing us, and thank you, Duende District and Word for Diversity for hosting us. And thank you, everyone who is listening now and who will be listening to us later. It is indeed a pleasure for me to have this conversation with Rajika. I enjoyed her book, and I also learned a lot from the book. Though it deals a lot with experiences that are similar to mine, there are experiences that are different. And so, what I like with the book is that it is instructive. There's a lot of analytical work in it, but it's also very personal. It's a combination of a memoir and a nonfiction book that has policy implications for government as well as for people. So with that, I think I'm ready to start with my questions. And please don't forget, buy the books from Duende. Please buy the books from Duende. They are doing great work. So, Rajika, I think I'll start by asking you what led you to write the book? What were your objectives when you started?
Thanks for that, Vinod. And let me just take a second also to thank our organizers. And I'm just so delighted to have this opportunity to speak with you because your book also just came out, I think, about a month before mine. And I've just been so struck by the similarities, even though yours is a novel and mine is a memoir, by the similarities of many of the themes that I hope we'll get into more over the conversation. But for me, one of the primary motivations was that having come to the US as an international student or a foreign student, and having been through that journey of arriving on an American campus and then following the path to becoming an immigrant and becoming an American, there was the growing realization, and then as someone, so one of the aspects about the book, which is why there's sort of the memoir piece and there's the research driven analysis almost, is that I spent many years as an international student in North Carolina. I eventually became an immigrant, and then my life took a very interesting turn, and I narrate this in the book, where the tables were turned, where I found myself professionally working in a role where I became a researcher about international students and began to learn what that journey looks like, who these individuals are. So it was sort of being the outsider, but looking in on an experience that I myself had been through. And during this time, I came to realize that that part of the immigrant narrative in the US is really not well understood. What that pathway looks like, from education to, I think some of our listeners may have heard of H-1Bs, of green cards, and sort of what's known as the skilled immigrant pathway is really not well understood, because we tend to look at the individuals who come out at the end of it, who are often, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, who are scientists, who are doctors at the forefront of COVID, who are authors and highly successful people, the latest addition being the new CEO of Twitter, who's an Indian who came to the US as an international student, much like me. But when we look at those success stories, we tend to not know what that journey behind them is, which is fraught with a lot of challenges. It's not easy. So that was one of the primary motivations, that I really wanted to connect the dots and tell the story in a way of that journey that hadn't been told before. And also the other reason was that I feel that in a very broad sense, there is not a good understanding within American society of who international students are, what value do they add to American society. I mean, there's value in actual economic terms. An American degree is the 6th largest service export for the US, in that America sells more college degrees to the rest of the world than many other exports. But value in other ways as well. And these issues really came to a head, I think, over the past 5 or 6 years, as the US and America as a country felt very unfriendly to people from other countries. And certainly immigrants and international students were very much caught up in that. And that's what sort of really led to my feeling I had to write this book, and it was a story that needed to be told.
So I guess you're referring to the 9/11 events, how that affected the American perception of, well, foreigners and of students and of immigrants.
So that's a very good question, because you're right that 9/11 was actually the first time in recent history where, prior to that, international students in the US were really not scrutinized much. They were just people who ended up on American campuses and, came home with your child for Thanksgiving, etc., but seen as fairly benign people. But things really changed with 9/11. The reason being that initially there was the suspicion that several of the terrorists were on student visas, but ultimately it was determined that actually it was one of them who had been on a student visa, and that too had gone back before his visa expired. But that really altered the perception in the eyes of the American public of who international students are. And unfortunately, we went through a phase in the US where, of course, it led to a great deal of anti-immigrant sentiment. International students got caught up in that. The numbers of people coming to the US really fell, but they eventually recovered, and they recovered very nicely until the previous administration came in, and that's the phase I was referring to about 5 or 6 years ago. And there was this the travel bans happened. Those were one of the first sort of onslaughts against not just international students, but really anybody who was seen as the outsider or the other wanting to come to the US. And then after that, there was proposal after proposal that was very damaging, and that really led to this perception around the world that the doors of America, particularly American colleges and universities, are really no longer open to welcoming people from around the world the way they have for almost 200 years.
And now, of course, the situation has changed. Students are coming back. Could you maybe explain? There's this perception that foreign students cost money. But in fact, what your book brings out is that foreign students contribute financially to the health of the university system. Could you just say something about that?
Absolutely. And, there is this misperception of international students sort of being interlopers who are always taking away, that they first come to the US and they take away our college seats, then they take away our jobs. But if you look at the actual data and the reality, as you said, it's very different. So I alluded to this earlier, but international students significantly contribute to the financial bottom line of most universities. Many people don't realize it, that certain programs and departments would probably not stay afloat if it were not for the financial contribution that foreign students are bringing in, because many of them are full fee paying students. So one way of looking at it is that they're actually subsidizing educational opportunities for other domestic American students. And again, that's because very often they're paying higher tuition and fees, they're paying full tuition and fees when they come to a US college and university. And up until last year ago, that contribution was huge, where it was almost $45 billion. And then in just, like I said, it was the 6th largest service export for the US. But in just the past year, we've, of course, seen a drop because, again, all of higher education was so disrupted last year that there was a big drop, mainly because of the pandemic, in the number of students who came. And it had a massive, massive negative impact on the bottom line of US colleges and universities.
So while they are students, they are contributing to the health of the university system. Then there's a transition from student to immigrant, right? And as I mentioned at the beginning, your book is also a personal book. So could you, tell us about the transition? How did the decision come about for you to decide to stay here? And maybe, what I remember is when I read your book, the part where you describe this is very lyrical. When the day you leave, you are in Delhi and you look at the roofs of Delhi, and it became a novel at that point to me. So if you could address that question and maybe then give us a short reading, a short excerpt from your book.
No, thank you for that. So one of the things I do in the book is that I really slow down that process and describe not just from the whole immigration barriers perspective or what it feels like to become an immigrant in the US, but also what's really going on in the mind and heart of someone who is poised at this point. And I should preface this by saying I am lucky that I had that choice to make. I do want to acknowledge that there are different forms of immigration journeys, and certainly in the past several years, we've seen a rise in forced displacement, the refugee crisis, and the whole undocumented immigration phenomenon where people are fleeing and don't necessarily have a choice. I had a choice, and that's what I reveal in the book on what's going on psychologically and emotionally. And that, I think often there's a sense that, oh, a switch goes off and one day you're not an immigrant and the other day you are an immigrant. But that is not, in fact, how it happens. It's a very long, drawn out, protracted, painful process of constant negotiation as you're going back and forth between your homeland and this potentially adoptive country and trying to make these choices. So for me as well, I never came to the US intending to immigrate. And in fact, I talk about that conflict in the book, where I say that I was an accidental international student and I was an accidental immigrant, in that I never intended to be either. And in fact, for the longest time, my family wanted me to come and study in the US, and I refused because I used to always see the US. In the book, I allude to it as sort of a land of honey. And I didn't want to become a fly trapped in American honey and all the riches and temptations of America. So it's a conflict. And so Vinod's asked me to read a short piece, and I will read that. And
I
this
love
passage,
that bit. Yeah.
this passage comes from a final trip back to India, where I've actually gone back wanting to move back to India because of the sense that I want to give back to my country. I don't want to abandon my country, and I'm going to go back. And I go back and I'm there for several months looking for a job. And eventually I come to the realization that India is no longer for me. So this moment sort of captures when that decision is made. My desire to return to India came down to a sense of idealism, perhaps misplaced. I didn't want to become one of those, the millions who had left India and now remained trapped in first world honey. I thought I was better than all of them, that I would return to give back to India in small measure what it had given me. India needs you, said a patriotic family friend, hoping to convince me to return. But after 6 months of trying to find my place in India, I was no longer sure this was true. All those who had questioned my desire to return to India didn't understand what it felt like to be an immigrant, strung between two worlds, a constantly fragmented existence. 1 foot here and 1 foot there, juggling 2 time zones, 2 systems of measurement, and 2 cultures. I was tired of the never-ending dance. Those who had never left home could not understand the homesickness that often caught me unawares, washing over me in waves as I thought about the first drops of rain on dry earth that heralded the Indian monsoon, or as I longed to eat an Indian mango whose sweetness reminded me of carefree childhood summers spent feasting on buckets of chilled mangoes. They could not understand the almost visceral longing to return. After 6 months in India, I had made my decision. That night in Delhi, the city where I was born and the foundation for the first 21 years of my life in India, I went up to the roof of my grandparents' house. The sky was a dull gray pink, the colors of dusk muted by the ever-present smog. Flocks of parakeets roosted in nearby trees. Clusters of houses stretched out in the horizon, mingling with the dilapidated domes and soaring minarets of Delhi's ancient Mughal monuments. As the sky darkened, lights began to twinkle. This is how I would always remember Delhi. Could I ever return to live here? The answer was no. There was nothing more for me here. India and I had both changed and grown, but in different directions. I had become a foreigner in my own country.
Yeah, that sums up the situation of a lot of us, right? Now, once you made the decision and you had to look for a job, uh, and so I'm not going to ask you about just how you went about looking for a job, but I'd like you to kind of share with us your reflections on your experience as an Indian woman, as a brown woman looking for a job. And also, what was interesting in your book, you mentioned the fact that in India, you're regarded as fair. And that provided you certain advantages over others. And then when you came here, the situation changed because you were not white, you were brown. So could you address the issue of being a brown woman in America and how, I mean, we can see you're now a very successful woman. So what were the obstacles and how did you overcome them or how did you deal with them?
So in my book, I refer to this as sort of a triple cumulative disadvantage, where soon after I arrived in the US as a naive 21-year-old, fairly young, coming from a more patriarchal culture, I soon began to realize, and this became actually more entrenched for me, and I became more aware of it as you sort of asked at the top of your question, as I began to actually make my way in American society, not just as a student, but beginning to think about opportunities for myself. And there was the awareness that I was sort of the three things where I was foreign, I was female, and that visibly I belonged to a distinct minority group, which in those days, the stereotype or mascot for which was the character Apu from The Simpsons. So there was this sense that there are these big odds stacked against me. And it's been a journey of really negotiating all of those. And I think those are a lot of the conversations we are having these days, right? Around social justice, around racial issues, on the intersectionality of all of these. And that was indeed my experience as well. And I will say that it has taken me more years than I care to admit at this event, more years, a lot of years to actually find sort of what I call my voice and my place in society, of sort of being confident as who I am in who I am and feeling that I can have a voice despite the fact that I still retain my Indian accent. You retain your Mauritius Indian accent. And that, we are all the more confident for that, because those are the different shades of America. Around the sort of the second part of your question, so one of the aspects I lay out in my book on sort of on what I lay out is that education, or the opportunity to be in another country as a student, is profoundly transformative, because it's an opportunity to not just learn about the country that you've gone to and the society you've gone to. And I would actually love to hear your reflections as well, Vinod, but because you've had a similar journey, but that it's really an opportunity to also learn about the home that you've left behind and to learn about yourself. And that's what I found happened with me, that it was only after I came to the US, had been here for a while, that I could begin to confront my own biases. I could begin to understand the biases of the society that I had left behind, the prejudices, a lot of which were around skin color, which of course tied to racism and casteism. and become more aware of those and hopefully be a more enlightened human being. On a personal level, it was very interesting for me because, as you said, there was a sense of you're lighter skinned, and lighter skinned equates to being more desirable. And now I arrive in America where I'm again visibly part of a certain minority group. And the fact that I might be lighter skinned doesn't matter because I'm immediately put into, I'm immediately seen through a certain lens. So it's been, it's really been a very educational time of sort of learning about one's own biases, learning about the Indian immigrant community in the US and how it views issues of race and skin color. And I think a lot of those conversations have really, really come to a head in just the past couple of years because of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think many South Asians realizing that we are very much part of the fabric of, of minority groups in the US. And yes, we can put up our white picket fences and we can send our kids to Ivy Leagues, but at the end of the day, we need to be compatriots with our other with other minority groups. So I'll stop there. But I would love to, you've had a similar journey, so I would love your
Yeah,
thoughts from that
in
perspective.
my case also, I mean, I came here as an accidental student in the sense that in the normal run of things, I would have ended up in the United Kingdom or
Mhm.
in France. What I should tell, the audience listening here now, Mauritius is a multilingual, multiracial country, and so essentially, when I grew up, my mother tongue is Bhojpuri, but by
Mhm.
the time I go to primary school, I learned French and English. But the lingua franca of the country is Creole, which is a dialect of French with words of Hindi, Arabic, and English in it. So linguistically, you know, we are multilingual. Then culturally, the population of Mauritius is 65% of Indian origin, 25% of African origin, and the remainder are French and Chinese. So I grew up with kind of at home with Hindu values, then got exposure to what is called Judeo Christian values at school. And so I am kind of that product.
Mhm.
And in the course of writing, I mean, my objectives in writing my novel were twofold. One, it was to kind of take stock of my life, but second, also to kind of put Mauritius on the American literary map. Since Mauritius is, unlike India, Mauritius is completely unknown. And so, to go back to, to link it to your question, right? We have whites, black, brown. We have the whole spectrum of colors in Mauritius. And then within each community, even in among the white community, there's a Grand Blanc and the Petit Blanc, the big and the small white, right? So it's quite complicated. What unites us is, in a way, the Creole language, the fact
Mhm.
that the island, there's, you have nowhere to run. So, in that sense, Mauritius has been a success. But in what writing the novel made me do was reflect that it is not a paradise. My novel is not about the Mauritius that is depicted as a paradise. It's not about the Mauritius of the beautiful beaches. It's not the Mauritius where people go for fancy weddings. No, it is about not only the joys of being in a multiracial society, but also the challenges. It's challenging to live in a multiracial society. So that's what my kind of intellectual journey has been like. As far as the journey, the student immigrant journey, and unlike my case, a bit different from yours in the sense that when I went to Mauritius, uh, it's just at that time, Mauritius at that time was considered to be a kind of less developed country.
Mhm.
Since then, things have changed so much. Like I can say, my experience growing up is quite different from the experience of my younger sister growing up. When I grew up, an orange was a luxury. And my younger sister tells me, I can't complain about my childhood. I had everything I wanted, you know. So I would say now the situation is such that there are university graduates who go back home. But
Yes.
in my case, when mind you, uh, I came here in 1971. I got my doctorate in 1980. In the late 70s, early 80s, Mauritius had not yet taken off, and there just were no opportunities available. There just were no opportunities available, and this, I have to say that America, with all its problems, and it has a lot of problems, which you've talked about earlier, at that time for me to remain the land of opportunity.
Hmm.
And that's what it has been, I guess, for the Indian diaspora here and for many diasporas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it definitely has been, and there's a lot of speculation around. Well, does the U.S. continue to be attractive, especially for students who are quite critical for the U.S. if they choose to become immigrants? But not only if they become immigrants. I mean, even if they go back to their home countries, each person who's been in the US and goes back kind of becomes an unofficial ambassador for their experience and their time in the US. So there is concern that will people continue to come, and is the US now a fading beacon? But I think that that remains to be seen. So I want to actually go back to one of the, you began to talk about your book and some of the reasons you wrote it, and I love that point about putting Mauritius on the map. And that's why I really wanted to have this conversation with you today, because I think Mauritius is such an important part of the Indian diaspora, which is, of course, distributed all over the world, and people of Indian origin to be found, in the Caribbean, in the US, in Australia, and I think almost every part. But you're right that that journey to Mauritius and has really not been narrated much before. So I want to go back to that and ask you some of the choices you made as an author. So first off, you wrote your book as a novel, but it's very autobiographical in many ways. So I will observe that
Yeah.
that you wrote it as a novel. And let me just add two more parts to that question, and then you can think about that. But I'm also really struck by the structure and how you wrote it. That it's a novel, but some could say it's a collection of essays. You've also got beautiful poetry in there. So tell us a little bit about some of those choices you
So,
made and why.
yeah, it started as a memoir
Mhm.
and became a novel, largely because a novel allowed me to do a lot of things with the material of my life. In the sense that, for one thing, uh, I my first writing, I wrote a screenplay, and I learned a lot from that. And one of it was, the technique of dramatic compression. In a novel, you can sort of compress events that take place over 10 years and make them all happen in 1 year, and that changes the pace of the story, and it makes it a stimulating read. For instance, in there's one chapter in my novel where I deal with what happening, when the major cyclone hits Mauritius, and it was a big disaster. Now, the cyclone the chapter covers 3 days, but all the events that you read about in that chapter, put now in is essentially a short story. It's a short story about events that really took place over a whole year, but I make them happen in 3 days. That's fiction allows you to do that. Fiction also allows you to sort of merge memories, play, manipulate enables you to manipulate your memories. I'll take a concrete example. There is an instance where I saw my aunt confront another woman. I start the story with that. And then I years later in New York City, I see the cover album of Santana's Abraxas. And that really striking to see this, woman sitting there. There's a dove and an angel above her. I was very struck by the color of it and so on. And then even another 10 years later, I read Herman Hesse' coming of age novel, Demian. I take those three totally unrelated events, but I use my imagination and I weaved all the three into one story. So that is something that you do, that fiction allows you to do, which is manipulating events and altering the order of events and so forth. And as for poetry, I am actually I see poetry and prose as tools in my toolbox, literary toolbox. So if I want to express moments of heightened emotion, if I want to tell a story in a very concise way, poetry is the way to go. That's why I also use poetry. And there's also the musicality of poetry. So my goal really in writing is also to provide some pleasure. It's I want the reader to feel emotionally the events that the character goes through. And lastly, I also I tackle head on the politics of my country. And so I had to make sure to avoid lawsuits against lawsuits that these politicians might have. You never know. So,
Indeed. Not to be flip, but that is indeed one of the great worries of writers these days. And in my case, it was a memoir and nonfiction. So I spent a lot of time fretting and worrying about everybody in the world who could potentially sue me. So that is indeed the worry of authors these days. So we're at about almost 6:45. Maybe we'll do a check-in with Angela and Susie to see how we're doing on time, and if they'd like us to take questions. So let's see. So with the journey of the book, I found the book to be very difficult to write, mainly because I really wanted to tell the personal story. And as Vinod mentioned during our conversation, it is a very personal story. In many ways, it's also a coming of age story of a young woman who comes to the US and becomes an immigrant and sort of finds herself during that process. So I wanted to tell that story, but I also, based on what I knew from being immersed in the lives of international students and immigrants as a professional, I also wanted to surface these broader issues that really again came to a head with the election of Donald Trump some years ago. So I had sort of been fighting that and not wanting to tell that side of the story, but then really began to feel the urgency of it. So the greatest challenge for me was really, how do you marry those two pieces? So even though I've been writing for many years, I think for me, part of the process was just looking at other memoirs, and I must have looked at about 100 of them, if not more, in looking at how other authors, whether it was J.D. Vance with Hillbilly Elegy, or one of my favorites is The House on Sugar Beach, and so many other wonderful memoirs on how they had accomplished that, where there's very much the personal story, but it is also about a much larger narrative than just that one individual, because it's a narrative of societies and cultures. And in many ways, my book is, at the heart of my book is the message of how America has engaged with the rest of the world through education, and how it really remains a critical way of connecting countries. So I would say that that was the challenge, and that ultimately led to the book as you in addressing that as you see today. Vinod, do you want to start?
What is the role of storytelling? What is the role of storytelling in the way that foreign students are perceived in the US and when they return home to their home countries? I have to confess one thing. I grew up in a country, Mauritius, when I was growing up. Writing was not something we considered ever. I went to sort of what it was considered to be the best high school on the island, right? I had great teachers, but no one ever mentioned writing. None of my teachers advised us to be a writer. The leading writer in Mauritius at that time was Malcolm de Chazal, who was considered great in France, right? But in Mauritius, he was regarded as a madman. That's the kind of the environment I grew up in. So I would say that storytelling did not play a large role in my sort of growing up. However, since then, in the Francophone world, Mauritian authors have made quite a mark. I mean, we even have a Mauritian who won the Nobel Prize, writing in French. That's Leclésio. We have Ananda Devi. We have Natasha Apana. So I said, now there's a newer generation of Mauritian authors who have produced, many stories. Now, these stories have made their way in Europe, but not yet in the United States. So I am hoping that my novel will be one story that Americans will read about. I think in India it's quite different. I think there the literary culture is much stronger than in Mauritius. But Mauritius hopefully is catching up. Yeah.
So maybe I'll respond to that from a slightly different angle, if I'm understanding the question correctly, or interpreting it. I mean, there are a couple of different interpretations to it. I would say that actually foreign students or international students have not really been present as the subject in storytelling in the US. And I write a newsletter, and in fact, one of my issues over the summer was doing a special summer reading issue where I featured a handful of books where the protagonist or the main character incidentally happened to be an international student. So there's Chimananda Ngozi Adichie's Americana. There are others, but the fact that the characters in those forms of storytelling have been international or foreign students has been quite incidental. So it has not been a deep examination of what exactly that experience is. And, I'll maybe go out on a limb here and say that that was also one of the reasons why I wrote my book, because again, that journey had really in and of itself not been examined in depth. So I would say that they haven't been featured much in different forms of storytelling in the US. And actually, I have not seen that many narratives also around international students returning to their home countries. So maybe there's a real gap there, but I haven't read much around that. So I don't know. Okay, so we have.
Oh, I'll answer that question first.
And I have thoughts too, so I will go after you. And I want to see if our responses are the same or different.
In Mauritius, in the late 60s, the elite universities were considered to be Oxford, Cambridge, and La Sorbonne in France, right? When it came to the United States, we knew about Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. And I also only knew about Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. I finally, I got a scholarship to Wesleyan, but I had no idea what it was about. Now, what I wish I knew was that there were good universities in California, because the weather is so much nicer in California. That's what I wish I knew. I also wish I knew more about sort of the role, like I had the chance to apply to the University of Chicago. But when I thought of Chicago, I thought of Al Capone. Our view of America was shaped by Hollywood. And I wish I had known that America is not the America depicted in movies. America is much more complex than that. So these are two things. I wish I had known there were universities in California, and I wished that my view of America had not been so much influenced by movies.
So for me, and I talk a lot about this in my book, is that I wish I had known more or better understood how dramatically different the American classroom and campus culture is based as compared with the Indian one. And I would say actually not just the Indian, but many Asian countries. And Vinod, I don't know whether that was the case in Mauritius as well, but where the classroom environment is very hierarchical, and the professor is the sage on the stage, and the American classroom atmosphere is very different, particularly at the college level and beyond. And I'll never forget my sense of shock of walking into class and seeing a student munching their way through a sandwich with their feet up on a chair and swigging a Coke, and my professor urging all of us to call him by his first name. Now, these are just, these may seem like superficial examples, but they really speak to much deeper differences across cultures on how students are being educated, how they're coming up through an education system. And you can, as a student coming to the US, you can know everything you need to know, especially these days with the internet, about which tests you need to take, what are university rankings. To Vinod's point, I think one of the big differences today is that students coming to the US, or international students anywhere, I refer to them as savvy consumers, because they have information on their fingertips and they know how to make those choices. But that doesn't mean that they are well prepared enough to understand how dramatically different that campus life and that classroom experience is going to be, whether it's even things like understanding concepts of academic integrity. I've also been an adjunct professor. I've taught students from around the world, and I've seen that very often where it may seem like a case of plagiarism, the student has actually not understood or been trained and prepared to understand that what does it mean to paraphrase, what does it mean to quote. You don't just take information and repeat it. So I think there are huge cultural divides, and those actually still exist. And I think those continue to be some of the big challenges for many students, that they're not fully prepared for that.
I went to a high school. There's an echo. I see. I went to a high school where the class size was very small, so we were constantly challenging what the teacher was saying, and we always engaged in debate, which we see in the US. So for me, that was not a big change, but I can imagine in educational systems where the teachers regarded as kind of the ultimate authority, the American system can come as a shock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Vinod, I'm looking here, and actually
We have 5 minutes.
we have 5 minutes, but we also had a request from Angela if you wanted to read a brief piece from your book, if you had it handy, and especially
Yeah,
one of the poetic pieces.
maybe
I know we have one more question, but maybe if you want to read something brief, and then.
Oh yeah. So what I'll do, I mean, since people know about Mauritius, I will choose a passage that illustrates that.
Okay.
I am, the host family takes the protagonist to an American football game in Hartford. At halftime, the crowd got excited over the beauty pageant. The guy sitting on the bench in front of me got up and turned, beer can in hand, half his shirt hanging over his jeans. "Where are you from? India or Pakistan?" he said. "Neither. I'm from Mauritius." Where is that? "It is an island in the Indian Ocean." "So it's part of India." "No, it is off the coast of South Africa, 2,500 miles from Cape Town." "Africa," he said, and paused for a moment. He gulped down some beer. "What kind of government do you have there? Tribal government?" The question disconcerted me. What do they teach about Africa in schools? I asked myself. I remained calm and replied, "It's a parliamentary democracy based on the British system. You have a president, we have a prime minister." The man took a bewildered swig. He squinted his eyes, strained to formulate a question, failed, and took his seat. The crowd cheered as another beauty contestant flaunted her assets on the field. Bill nudged my elbow. "Next time, say you are from India. Mauritius is way too complicated. Too many syllables. People like him can't handle it." Mrs. Tucker's face was red. "This man is ignorant. Let's move to another seat," she said. Mrs. Tucker had barely got up when the man was back on his feet, this time with a fully formed question. "Who civilized your people?" I sprung up and faced him. For the first time in my life, I felt my national honor at stake. The honor of a nation only 3 years old, but my nation nonetheless. In my Oxbridge A-level high school course, 2 years earlier, I had written a paper on the difference between the words civilization and culture, and I still remembered the definition of civilization. I summoned up my courage. "Do you know the meaning of the word civilized?" I asked him. He was taken aback. He didn't reply. "English is your mother tongue, isn't it?" His face was blank. I looked him straight in the eye. "Civilize, bring out of barbarism, enlighten, refined. While your ancestors were barbarians living in caves, my ancestors were building cities. We were producing literature." Two guys sitting next to him forced him down to his seat. His beer can fell from his hands and rattled down the rows. I looked around. The white people were red with embarrassment, the Tuckers being the reddest. The black Americans smiled. A young man with a huge afro hairdo raised his hand in a Black Panther salute and said, "Right on, brother." The crowd cheered as a loudspeaker blared the name of Miss Hartford, 1971. That's my trying to explain Mauritius.
That's wonderful. So, Vinod, we have one more question, and we're told that we can take it since we started a little late. So,
First,
here's
I think I want to remind whoever's listening, buy the books from Duende.
and they've been doing a great job with the links on the open chat. I can see the links, so thank you for that. Okay, so here's our next and last question.
Who are some of the people who have helped inform your ideas and perspectives? Why don't you take that one first?
So that's a broad question, but I think more than mentioning specific people, I want to say that what's been most valuable for me, and even in bringing me to this point, is really some of the women mentors that I've had in my life. And they don't necessarily need to have been authors or artists, but people who've been mentors to me. And the mentorship has been really important because even though they may have been colleagues, professional colleagues, they've helped me really gain the confidence to do a lot of things that I've done and to have the courage to tell this story and write this book. So I would say mentorship is so important, and some of the women mentors in my life have been incredibly invaluable to me. Just in terms of, since we are talking, it's about literature and books, I'll mention a few authors who've influenced me, whose work I love. I think it's to be expected that I would love immigrant narratives. That's a genre I definitely read, and travel writing also. And some of the people who really influenced me through their writing include the author Pico Iyer, who is primarily a travel writer. I mentioned Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie earlier. I think she's a very powerful writer. And then in the realm of, she's of course written in different genres, but in the realm of fiction, one of my favorite immigrant writers has actually been Ha Jin, the Chinese American writer. And I think he's a very powerful writer. So those are just a few who I'm going to mention, and turn it over to you, Vinod, on how you'd like to address that question.
Yeah, who has shaped my sort of perspectives? I have to say, I consider myself a cosmopolitan person in my outlook.
Mm-hmm.
It could be because I grew up on an island surrounded by, people from different, whose ancestors come from different parts of the world. So my view on life and events is a cosmopolitan one. I am proud to be a Mauritian. I'm proud to be an American, but um, also I also look at myself as a kind of citizen of the world. My teachers in high school were very influential in sort of making me think about that the world is bigger than just Mauritius. It's bigger than just you, and hence they emphasized always this need to travel,
Mm-hmm.
need to be exposed to different ideas and perspectives. So I owe a lot to my high school teachers, especially those in English and French literature. Then when I came to Wesleyan, there's one mentor actually who appears in my novel. He was a major influence. He was a professor originally from Romania, a Romanian Jew who taught French literature and French philosophy. And I had the it was great for me to work with him as a research assistant. And he was blind, and I was his reader. And so I got paid essentially for taking his course. but because I had to read all the student papers and all the books that he read, I was his reader. So that reading was very influential, played a major role. And he also, I have to say, again, he had this cosmopolitan perspective. And the fact that I worked in an international institution, the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation, made me, I in a way, I grew up. I was spoiled. I just, I grew up, and even in my professional life, I was constantly exposed to ideas from various parts of the world. Yeah.
And I know we're out of time and we're going to turn it back to our hosts. But one thing I just wanted to observe, and we don't have time to go into it today, but maybe for our listeners, we'll just share that one of the really interesting things about both Vinod and myself is we don't come from a more traditional literary background, in that neither
Yes.
of us have built careers as full-time writers and authors, and we've both had long careers. I still continue to, Vinod, I don't know about you, but we both had long careers in the international affairs field, with me working in international education and you were with a large multilateral organization at bank, the World Bank. So to me, that's a very interesting coincidence. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess we are also part of the Indian diaspora.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Of course.
You both were so wonderful. Thank you so much. I knew it was going to be an amazing conversation, and you just blew it out of the water. Two of the best you had it all set up. It was perfect. I am just like, get these books, y'all. They
Get
are
them from
amazing.
Duende.
Get them from Duende. I know, I need to have you in when I start doing live events again. You are welcome anytime at any Duende. And so are you, Rajika. Absolutely. Just sort of, he's in DC. But
I'm happy to come to DC anytime.
Everybody come. You guys, y'all are welcome in DC. Y'all are welcome because we have location in Albuquerque. Everybody is welcome. I can't wait until I have a little one, so I know it'll be a while before we start doing live events. But thank you both. Thank you both so much. What a wonderful conversation. What just perfect.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you again to these incredible authors. Buy these books, and as Vinod says, buy them from Duende.
Yeah.
Angela Maria Spring, for being here tonight. Thank you for hosting us. I'm so excited to partner with you on this and get to be part of this conversation. Thank you for reading these books to us tonight. Thank you for your conversation. I love that you illuminated so much about the process of these books and your own stories and how they became the books they became, the relationship between memoir and fiction and how tricky that can become. And creative as a process. So I learned a lot from both of you tonight. I want to thank you again for spending some time with us this evening. And to all of our viewers at home, thank you so much for tuning in. For those of you who are watching now, for those of you who will be watching later, thank you again for tuning in. You can check out more of what we're doing at Duende District and thewordfordiversity.org. Good night, everyone, and thank you for being here.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Bye-bye.